I guess I need to turn off that little fade in and have the image back off. But yeah, hello.
Full image.
Hey, Sharon.
Hi, good morning. Welcome to the latest episode of the Project Failure Files. The series is for anyone who manages projects for a living in any way, shape, or form. So if you've been a project manager, program manager, product manager, group manager, operations manager,
All of
any
the
of
above.
those or more things, maybe you owned your own business, maybe you're a consultant, maybe you wear all the hats, this weekly series is definitely for you. I'm Sharon Weaver, CEO of Smarter Consulting.
And I am Christian Buckley, founder of Collab Talk. And welcome to another episode of our series. I feel like we should have vocal effects and have a little echo there. But this is where Sharon and I explore project management topics from the perspective of what not to do as you manage projects. In each episode of Project Failure Files, we'll talk about the common pitfalls, sharing some of our personal stories and experiences. We're not afraid to talk about the positive things and the failures, and explore strategies and best practices to help you to be successful.
So in this episode, we are talking about a problem that happens all organizations, and it's confusing roles, business analysts versus project managers.
I like the title too, that we want, like, that is it that it's a confusing role, or is it that a company is confusing the roles, or both? So but yeah, this is a mistake made in many organizations who they treat, and I know you've seen this, Sharon, because we've talked about it, hence the episode. But they treat a BA as a junior PM, which is it's just a very different function.
Yeah, it's not. I know both of us have spent time in both of these roles, formally and informally. So this is going to be a really good conversation.
Agreed. And as with every single episode, please feel free to comment throughout the episode and share your experiences and any great examples or feedback that we may have missed.
Okay, so let's get started with some definitions. I know I've participated in the IIBA, which is the International Institute for Business Analysts, for many, many years. So in your experience, what do you think the definition of a business analyst is?
Well, I've always viewed, so I started my career as a technical writer and business analyst. My job was just at the highest of levels was to be the person who understands the business rules, the business systems, the needs of the business, and translates those for the technical team. So the engineers, IT, on that side of the house, and vice versa, to go and say, well, here's the technical limitations. How do we take what you're asking for from the business and get that desired output from the limitations we have on the technology side, and being that bridge?
Yeah, I think we've probably both been around as long. I remember at the very beginning of my career journey, I was still kind of early. They were defining STLC and methodology, and the business analyst role in and of itself was kind of a new concept. And so I think, even then, throughout that lifespan, they've been trying to like better and better define the differences. But really the business analyst has kind of come out of this exactly what you're saying. It's defining like, what is the scope? How do we know what it is? How do we define the business problem? And then translating what the business needs to the technical folk and how to solve the problem, right? So it's that translation piece in between of understanding what the requirements are, being able to define them, being able to document them, and then being able to translate them so that ultimately the solution that is created is what's actually solving the problem.
And to be fair, I mean, I've worked for some organizations, it was a while back, but that did have the BA as like a more junior role. They were the meeting note takers, the go and kind of capture those things and then hand them off for others to go and do and to build. And so that was my perspective going for many years, was of that type of role. And so, and I, looking back now, I could see that there was some imposter syndrome around that role and the importance of that role. I had a chance to work with a company. It was working with Cisco in the late 90s, I think, where they had a very different model. The BAs were much more senior roles, And it really shaped my perspective of the differences between PMBAs on that one massive project, and working with these BAs that were, again, senior people that were seasoned, that they understood those. And the idea of comparing that to project managers, which were more of the look, they took the scope of that. Sometimes a PM can kind of wear the multiple hats and might go and help define some of those pieces. Certainly, if you're handed a project and it's not all the details that you need to run the project successfully, you're going to go and root those things out and add to that project planning activity. But when you have a strong BA function, you should have most of that rooted out. They're then your source for answering those questions on the scope of the business desired outcomes of the limitations of that, so that you can focus on executing on that plan, building a plan around a building to that vision of what needs to be in place. And so it's very much a hand in hand role. So I think that goes back to what you said at the beginning in the intro, is that you might be playing the role of BA without having the formal title, which is,
Yeah.
my experience, is usually the case.
I think that, yeah, you're right. And I mean, there are some organizations, and I think we'll talk about this probably in some other sessions, but there are organizations that, in my opinion, are more mature in defining the differences between the roles and then properly managing those. And I think in the past, when we think about formal or a more waterfall methodology, I think it was a little bit more clear kind of which role was which. And then you kind of get into more iterative methodologies. Agile's pretty clear at what's going on in terms of those roles. And while a Scrum Master and a project manager are not the same exact role, it's kind of a little bit, the roles are a little bit more clearly defined. Whereas I think, some of the smaller shops or maybe places that are a little less mature, you tend to kind of wear more hats. And I think at the end of the day, if you boil it down, it's really that the business analyst is really responsible for gathering the information and defining the scope. And the project manager is really more responsible for managing the scope specifically. And I think like you said, in a lot of organizations, one person might be wearing that hat. They might also be wearing the BA QA hat. They might be wearing the BA PM QA hat, a lot BA PM QA technical writer hat. And sometimes the roles kind of merge into different pieces. But I think in the more mature organizations that have those roles defined, you can see a really big difference between the BA role and the PM role, which is just something to kind of watch for and understand.
Well, why would you say that understanding the differences between these roles is so important?
I mean, I've spoken and I taught a ton on, both roles and both topics. And I think the biggest thing that, in my opinion, becomes an issue is that because the BA is really tasked with defining the scope and making sure that the scope is being delivered the way that it should be, and the PM is really tasked with keeping the scope managed, meaning under time, under budget, but within delivery parameters. I honestly believe that if you are trying to be both roles, you are in conflict with yourself, because at the end of the day, the project manager's job is to keep it all contained and the BA's job is to deliver the right thing. And so it becomes very, very difficult to deliver the right thing, but also be responsible for managing the scope itself.
Maybe think as like an independent consultant if you are out marketing, selling services, then you're not delivering. If you're active in delivering, then you're not out there actively selling, finding, filling the pipeline, finding new customers. It's kind of a similar trade-off here. I mean, where a BA is going to go in and make sure that, hey, everything is accurate. And I see at this phase where we are, what's been delivered, I see like, hey, we need to clarify on these points. Otherwise, like, this is not, or like looking at the test results, the data that's coming out, the analytics of the first phase of the project, whatever that thing is. But the other thing is that I often say that the worst part about being a project manager is chasing people for status updates. around. Now, if you're doing that on the technical side and doing like the engineering management side of execution of that task, that's different than chasing every stakeholder to get their time. It's so much more complex. If you're doing both of those things, especially, but to have somebody that is more invested in the business stakeholders and taking what is happening, the status of the technical project, and translating that for the business stakeholders, that again is that role of the BA to go and do that.
Well, and think about it this way too. I think I'm going to kind of clarify with the audience. One of the things you're going to notice is these new roles that have come up in the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, things like product manager, product owner, which IIBA supports as part of kind of the BA role to some degree. And I think it clarifies it a little bit, because if you think about the fact that the BA's job is to advocate on behalf of the stakeholder, and the project manager's job is to advocate on behalf of the project, meaning the budget, the scope, the schedule. To your point, if I'm meeting with my stakeholders, I have to really think about what hat I have on. Do I have their best interest in mind, or do I have the budget's best interest in mind? Do I have their best interest in mind? Do I have the schedule's best interest in mind? And I think where I see the biggest failures in this area, so, we're talking about project failures, where I see the biggest failure is when you're forcing people to wear the same hat consistently. They end up oftentimes erring on the side of the project. They end up, saying, well, I have to prioritize the project because that's fair. And what ends up happening is the stakeholders end up losing out. Yep. Because they're so focused on staying within scope, within budget, within schedule, that the stakeholder doesn't have an advocate anymore. And so I think the biggest failure that I see is where delivery becomes, not what the stakeholders needed, but what the project could afford, instead of the other way around, because nobody was there to truly advocate for the stakeholder.
I remember my last project before I made the switch over to a technical PM role, my first formal project management role. And I had done some minor things that were project management related in the previous company, but this last role, the project, I remember having a conversation with a couple other BAs that were very senior, highly respected, and we were talking about this, like the fact that I did not care about the timeline. I did not care about the rest of the testing process and the SDLC around those activities. I didn't care. I was fiercely defending, here is what it was an external customer that I was there, on behalf of. So working with the internal stakeholders, but with this external customer, was the state of California, and very important project. So working with these government entities. But that was my job as the BA, to make sure that what was being delivered met what their requirements were. That was it. And so that is the clearest delineation between those two functions. As a PM, I'm all about the timeline, number one, the scope of that, the timeline, the resources that are being done, and then the budget of those things, of what's being asked. And so I'm looking for the stakeholders, or the BA in this respect, to speak up if they're saying, like, hey, this is not being met. Like, I'm not going to think about that. If I always would say silence is compliance as a project manager. I would do my best to ask those questions and draw that information out. But when there was that role, that function, that BA function, it was so much easier to ensure that. So you can't fall back on testing, on QA to find those things.
Right.
It needs to be in the design that we have this risk mitigation happening.
Yeah.
Like, clearly understanding what we're delivering.
Well,
which goes back to what we've talked about a lot of other times about knowing what you're building before you try and build it.
Yeah. Plan, right? Design, make sure you know what you're doing. No. And I mean, I think to your point, like, as that overlaps, one of the biggest problems too is that, I think PMs feel frustrated because, PMs are limited to managing that stuff. And I think that if you don't have a BA there, or if you don't have those roles really defined, then I think they can also get frustrated easily because, they're trying to have a good relationship with the stakeholders. But just, I mean, if you're constantly waging a battle between which hat am I wearing, and trying to decide which side do I end up landing on. I mean, just the relationships with your stakeholders, I think, suffer immensely, which ultimately, like you said, if maybe you're shortcutting something, maybe you're shortchanging something, but then everybody just kind of ends up in a lose-lose.
Oh, and by the way, for folks that are watching, so we got folks that are watching through each of the various channels here, but please feel free to comment, ask questions. We will try to address them. It looks like we're having with the platform, if you're watching on YouTube, then we can actually see your questions and pull them on screen. But I am monitoring off to the side there chat via X, is Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. But feel free to reach out and contact us. If we don't answer your question during the show, we'll get to it as soon as we wrap up here. Then, of course, you can find past episodes out on YouTube, and we have a community out on Facebook. So lots of places that you can go and find us and participate in the discussion. So with that, so talking about like the cultural differences between organizations that have a difference between this. I mean, that's something we can jump in and talk about, since we've both been in organizations that have embraced the PM and BA roles and those that have not, and some of the differences between them.
Well, and this is the whole have a methodology, have a plan, have a process. And I mean, I know I even struggle with this in our small business because, especially in a small place where you don't have very many people, everybody's wearing a lot of hats to serve a lot of roles. I think what ends up happening culturally is that people struggle with their role, because what ends up happening is I don't know what I'm supposed to do. When am I supposed to do it? What am I supposed to do? How do I deal with that relationship that we just talked about in the previous, portion of this? Is if my role is not clear, or I'm trying to perform too many roles, when it comes down to making decisions, I'm not entirely sure what decision to make. And I think that can cause a lot of frustration in the people who are filling that role, whether they're employees or contractors or consultants. I think they can get frustrated. And I think culturally, people aren't sure who to ask for what, and it can really cause problems. It puts projects at risk all the time.
It's really healthy to have as part of any project planning, activity, as a part of your communication cadence in your weekly team meetings, to go through. And I've seen this in organizations that I think had a healthier approach to these two functions, is that you're constantly going back and reviewing those roles and responsibilities, exactly to your point, where, and who owns this, who needs feedback on this task. In fact, as part of IT governance, it's always recommended that any new action, you kind of ask those questions, like who's the owner, who are the primary stakeholders that are providing feedback in, who are the people that just need to be aware of this, respond, to be CC'd on this, to be kept in the loop on this issue, and who are those that are happy on this in a multi-layered project, this tier, this phase, this wave, whatever you call it, this sprint. Just I'll check in at the next monthly meeting, where we go through and look at the detail of what was delivered. But to have as part of your methodology, that discussion around roles and responsibilities is a key difference between it, because exactly, organizations that don't have this type of structure, my experience has been there's constant battle, not surprisingly, that there's misaligned expectations and missed deadlines because of that. You have scope creep that happens often because of this, because, to your point, whose task is it? Who's supposed to go and follow up on that? Because you have where it's an integrated, hey, we just have our PMs, or we call them a program manager, and they do all of those things. Okay, fine. But you have some people that are stronger on the BA functions than others that do a good job of covering that, and others that have no experience in that type of role, and they focus only on the execution side. So that's the part that they do, and they miss a lot of those pieces. So we all have strengths and weaknesses, and by moving them all together and expecting everybody to perform the same with that function. I wrote an article years ago about the myth of the well-rounded employee. This idea, like there are those perfect people out there that just seem to be, they excel at everything that they touch. I've never been one of those people, but where I found as part of my path to becoming a people manager in the late 90s and early 2000s was, and we've talked about this often. It's why I'm a big fan of the book by Marcus Buckingham, First Break All the Rules, but is to identify and manage to people's strengths. But that's true for an organization as well. So culturally, if you recognize that, hey, there's a separation between these functions,
Mm-hmm.
let's do that. And maybe you have one title for everybody, but if you can, and maybe there's not the willingness, the leadership team to create a separate BA and PM roles, but you have those people on your team. This is somebody who's built PMOs and run shared services teams at multiple organizations. Have people that are strong in the BA function, and to co-manage a project with somebody that's strong at the execution PM functions.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, there's just so many overlaps that end up happening. Communication can get mistaken, and people don't know what's going on, and it's that whole idea of, yeah, the well-rounded employee, right? Oh, I can do a little bit of everything, and which means you're doing a whole lot of nothing, right? And I mean, I struggle with that too as a leader. It's like, that you're always like, every single day, what are my priorities, and what should I accomplish, and what am I being expected to do? And I agree, I'm the same way. Like, I really like pushing people's strengths. It's, what are you doing well, and what should you be doing? And when you understand what the role differences are, and you can identify, this role performs these tasks and has these deliverables, and this role performs these tasks and these deliverables, I think it makes it easier. And I remember many years ago when, developers even would be held kind of responsible for documenting requirements and doing test cases and doing their own project plans. And I used to think, developers having to test their own stuff. I mean, come on, like, you want to talk about conflict with yourself. I mean, how can you do that? You're the one that made it. It's very difficult to know, did I do something wrong? And so I think when these roles kind of get all blurry, it makes it very difficult to be able to know who's doing what and when. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people don't end up doing the things they should be doing, and it gets very messy very fast.
Now, for those that are wondering too, we're talking around it, but the word, I guess the words, the multitasking, it's actually a topic that we are going to cover next month. And so it's going to be episode, I was pulling up the schedule, Sharon. So the November 18th, episode 23 is the myth of multitasking. So we get into some of this that we're talking about here. But as with a lot of these topics, especially when we talk about the cultural aspects, the team aspects of project management, there's a lot of overlap between the topics. But yeah, and this, I think, again, I don't want to make this overly simplistic as a solution here, but it once again shows that being consistent, regular communication around these things, redefining if there's confusion. And this is something that a lot of younger PMs, newer PMs need to learn. This is that when there's confusion, ask a question, clarify. Don't wait for the fog, that like the cloud
to figure it out.
Yeah, like no, like they never do. It gets worse. You need to ask the questions. But having that kind of communication, the organizations that I think worked the best were those that, in my experience, again, my style, being born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm often said this, the closest to that Northern California Bay Area style of work was the Boston culture. When I worked for a company, we got acquired by a Boston-based company. And besides the accent being different, I just thought this just feels like, my 12 years of working in the Bay Area, Northern California, for tech companies. It had that same kind of passion and energy and that entrepreneurial spirit, that I just haven't experienced in so many other areas. Maybe working with teams over in London was the closest other region that had that same sense of urgency around this. But I digress on that topic. But you can't have fear of asking hard, difficult questions, or when it's not clear to you, because this is a lesson learned. Like if I'm asking this question, if I'm confused by the separation of roles or clarity on what we're supposed to go and do next, guarantee you other people have those same questions.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it, right? It's, and we've talked about this in past sessions. I'm sure we'll talk about it in future episodes. But that whole idea of, having a culture where you feel comfortable to say, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. Can you help me define it? Can you help me prioritize my stuff? Can you help me understand more about this thing? And I know when I was young, in the more mature places that I worked for, especially young agile, I remember in early agile and early scrum, there was a big push for us to really understand the methodology and our roles. And, we had regular books that we were reading. We had regular training where people were coming in and explaining the difference between the roles and the difference, in the parts of the process and how it worked. And I don't know, how much I see that now. I don't think I see it as much, where when I talk to younger, newer BAs and newer PMs that are coming in, I think they're desperate and eager for learning to understand, what does this role even mean? But I think when you have a culture that says, here's what it is, let us help you understand, let us help you learn, let us help you grow, let's foster those roles, and let's define what they are for our organization. I think you just see more and more success because, that stuff being defined makes the organization more mature overall.
And it's always exciting too when you have people that are really embracing their roles and not looking at like where's the DMZ between the two roles. That's not the right way to look at it. Like there's
Mhm.
ever going to be a clear line of I do everything up to this line, you do everything other. Like one of the worst things you could say is like, hey, that's not my job to go and do. If my approach has always been, and I'll be honest, I've gotten in trouble in some companies. Like I often share like my time at Microsoft working there. I got in trouble several times by doing the look, it's not your job to do this, been told by a manager. And I said, yeah, it's nobody's job. And that's why it needs to be done for the client. We have to do this. I
Yes.
have experienced this. I'm going to do it. I'm happy to hand that off. I will get that started. I will carry this, answer the questions, fulfill this role until I don't need to anymore, but it's necessary for this. And so it's an important aspect of this goes back to the cultural, having that collaborative culture. I mean, it's a reason why I, named my company back when I started this on the side back in 2012. Collab Talk was about collaboration. It is about how do we create a collaborative culture so that people again are not afraid to ask the hard questions, but to step up and say, hey, we don't have all the answers here, but here's how we need to move this forward. And you have to be communicating. You have to be sharing this information back and forth and be ready to give up some things and take over some things that need to be done for that role. So it's another reason why you might on one project A, you might play more of a BA role because of the differences in the personnel on that side. You've got nobody really fulfilling that role over for the business for that project, but now you move over to another project where you've got a strong BA function, and so you can concentrate more on the PM functions. But you're able to kind of separate that, balance that by constantly talking about, hey, what are the roles and responsibilities around this activity?
Yeah, and I know I like to push things back to sports analogies a lot because I think it helps, but oftentimes, we get so lost in the task, we get so caught up in the task of whatever it is that we're doing that we forget about the goal. And that's exactly what you're saying is when we come together as a team and we're trying to accomplish a goal together, it makes a lot more sense because it's not about, well, it's not my job, right? Yeah, and short of a certain football player that may or may not be on the Kansas City Chiefs, we can't all do everything, right? We can't do all the roles. Like, can you imagine a quarterback, making the play, taking the ball from the very beginning all the way to the end without the team, without his team to surround him, taking out all of those people along the way is a very, very difficult thing to do the play from beginning to end. But if you think about each of those players being in their zone of genius and doing what they're really good at, now you put all that together and you can become unstoppable. And yeah, sometimes players have to maybe, do a different role, or they might have to help out, and go a little outside of their role to be successful. But by defining what those roles are and knowing what each part they're playing is, I think it makes the entire thing a little bit better. And that's all we're saying. We're saying sometimes BAs have to do some PM tasks, and sometimes PMs have to do some BA tasks, and sometimes devs have to do a little bit of a different task than what they're doing. But at the end of the day, if we all know what problem we're trying to solve, what goal we're trying to get to, what deliverable we're all trying to do together, let's focus on that collaboratively, and let's stop worrying about the individual tasks and try to just get the whole thing done.
Now, I do understand David's comment here, just cutting and assuming that another team will go and do this. And again, there might be reasons why you're cutting out the role. I mean, look, we understand the reality of, hey, budget cut for this, and we don't have this, or the timeline's cut short. We need to go do that. And so where are the areas that are cut? And you usually have like training is cut, QA process is cut.
BAs are luxury goods, right?
Yeah.
That's why I always say that BAs are luxury goods.
I know, but it's one of those areas where, you go and cut that. And what typically then happens is that the definition is that suffers from that up on the front end. So then your plan suffers from that. So you are more susceptible to risk because of those cuts.
Somebody else has to do that work. It's not like we don't need a BA, so we just don't do the BA work.
Yeah.
What you're saying is that what the BA does is not valuable enough, or you can't afford it, so we're not going to do it. And simply making that statement, like if you say it out loud, all of a sudden you're like, so you're creating an opportunity for risk that has to be way better managed. But oftentimes it's not better managed. It's just ignored.
Right. Well, I often say that the most successful project that I ever did, and I've not really thought about like all of my projects. I've had some that were shorter and very successful, but was one that was an 18-month project, but it was delivered over a weekend. That was a very nerve-wracking weekend, let me tell you. So that was a data center consolidation project. So massive project with hundreds of people that were involved in this over the 18 months, executing over that weekend. And we did it successfully, on budget, on time. And there was a lot that managed, but I had multiple BAs at different parts of the organization helping me. I was the overall PM. I then worked with PMs in each of the different business units that were in locations, these data centers that had, we would go through. That's where I first learned like the RACI model to go in. But again, we were constantly, every one of those meetings we talk about, and here's who owns it. Here's who's informed by it. Here's who the decision makers are of each of those roles. But it was something that, and this really kind of goes into, the practical tips for this, is that we set clear expectations right up front that like these are the project stakeholders. This was it part of the kickoff of the project. Here are the teams. Here's the leadership, the owners, the executive sponsors for each of these pieces. And here are the clear and distinct roles and responsibilities for each function. Where I was there, like if there's ever a question you don't know who to go to, Christian is the person that you go to. So the executive sponsor set it up for that level of governance, of management of the projects. And then I knew who the PMs and BAs were for each function. Somebody comes to me with the question, my triage then became really easy. That risk mitigation became easier. Wouldn't say easy, easier, because I knew who to go ask the questions about the business, who was then delivering on that scope. And I would let them go hash out some of the details for their area. But and so again, it goes back to that was one of the most structured projects that I've ever worked on, but I learned so much. I just feel so thankful to have had that experience early in my career that established that framework for me going forward.
Yeah. And I think, I agree. I think my most successful projects have identified the different roles. We've been able to work together and we viewed it as a team effort where we were trying to get to the same goal, not where we were in conflict with each other because, like I mentioned, when the BA represents the stakeholder and the PM represents the project, oftentimes it can be misunderstood as, well, we're going against each other. But my most successful projects have been people know what they're doing, their roles are defined, their tasks are defined, their responsibilities are defined, and we all understand that we're working together on the same thing and we're accomplishing the same goal together.
Yeah. It's having that mutual respect
Hmm.
is how you're going to, foster those relationships and build trust in your framework and your methodology as well. So if people see that, and this is one of those things like, how do you change the culture of an organization? You want to put more structure, and people think bureaucracy when they hear the word structure. It's like, no, you can be lightweight and move more quickly with structure than without, because
Yes.
you're not going back and making constant corrections and changes. And I would argue that if you are failing at the methodology, the structure side of things, then you're probably not also good at change management in general. So when you do have to make those changes, it's going to take longer, cost more.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's only so long you can go with kind of covering your eyes to not having these pieces in place. It's yeah, and as far as a career development, it's going to be difficult to move up, because if you can't show that you have met or exceeded expectations because of the constantly changing scope, people will just see that every project that this person was working on seemed to go over budget and take longer and couldn't count on any of that, versus they don't remember the headaches of the battles that they had. All they remember is that PM kept everything as a tight ship, kept us on time, on budget. And
Hmm.
I always knew, hey, this is what I need to go and do. Here's what my tasks are.
Well, yeah,
That's what they'll remember.
we always take the good ones for granted, right? I think that's the thing is like one of the things that I heard a long time ago is the best projects that people work on, they don't really remember how tight everything was run. They just remember that it was easy, they knew what to do, and they got their stuff done on time, under budget, and scope, as opposed to the people who don't do that. And that is when you see those failures, and that's where things go horribly wrong and everything's kind of a mess and people are confused and it takes longer, you spend more, things don't get delivered correctly. And so I think that's just it. If things are going well and they're organized, then you probably have a good process and you're following a good process.
It just made me think, it's like of course you remember the trauma situations. Like I remember all
Original.
the details now around the scooter versus car accident, where I was on the scooter versus the car. I did not
Mhm,
win that battle. I
mhm.
remember all the details around that. Similarly, to your point, I'm like, yeah, we remember some of the traumatic projects where we got in these fierce battles. We don't remember when everything was running smoothly. And in fact, I've caught myself saying this, having this struggle with, I've had some managers that's just like, and we've never really heard anything about you around this. Like, there's no talk. It's like, right, because we're executing, we're hitting our milestones. Like, when things are working well, you won't hear about us. We're just doing things in the background. Here's the status report. Here's what we're achieving. It's unfortunate sometimes that no, the loudest, the noisiest, the causing a tumult are the people that kind of come to the forefront of the leadership team. It's just unfortunate.
Well, and I think that's one of the tips that we have is to celebrate together, and I think that's really important because I think the projects that are run well typically are on time, under budget, and delivered well. And I think those are the ones where we're just like, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next thing we need to deal with? And we forget to stop and be like, dude, that was really awesome. Let's celebrate getting that across the finish line. And I would say the best projects I've ever worked on that did celebrate, I remember those celebrations. I remember how hard we worked. I remember we got it done, but I don't remember it being, overly dramatic and over stressful. But I do remember the stressful projects that didn't go right, didn't get delivered well, and we definitely didn't celebrate.
Well, and we've talked about too, to kind of wrap things up here, is like the idea of like, what are you documenting around this? And again, when so many people that are watching this and, either live or the recording of it, is that if you have that formal kickoff where you are clearly outlining the roles between BA and PM, and then throughout the process, part of your documentation is that you are capturing the roles and responsibilities and making that separation between those functions. And it's front loaded heavily for the BA's function. And then they provide throughout as more of that QA and change management function. They are the defenders of all things, business rules. And then on the back end, it's more of the PM, executing on those things. But you and I are also huge fans of the project postmortem. That is another
Yes.
opportunity to go back, assess all those things, and point out the need and the success of the separation of those roles and where they played through that process. That helps, again, reinforces that structure, reinforces the the process aspect of the methodology, and sets you up for future projects. If your organization is only thinking, well, that PM had this huge win and they did it, like, excuse me, it was a team effort. Here were the roles that were played. And that's something to be, as a PM, to be very careful that you are recognizing and rewarding those people that played those other roles, even smaller, lesser roles. Don't try to take all the glory for a completed project. Share that, and it will benefit everybody, but especially the PM.
In fact, I think we have an episode around lessons learned, where we're going to talk about lessons learned, because I think it's so important to really capture and do that postmortem and understand what went right, what went wrong. And people sometimes think about, certain things they did, but I don't know that they think about, the roles and the responsibilities were defined, or I felt good about my role. I felt like I knew what my responsibilities were. I think those are great topics. If you're not sure, like, what do I bring up in my postmortem? How do I even use those? I mean, those are the types of things that you should be thinking about. Did you feel good in your role? Did you feel good about everybody else's role? Those are things that can definitely be improved.
Yeah. Yeah, David, I mean, great point. So I just said it's the postmortem is critical, because you need to look at, it could be a short project where
Yes.
everything went exactly to plan. Great. Point that out.
What did we
Why
do
is that
right?
the case? Right. But to go through the postmortem, while it has a dark sounding title to it, but is one of the best things that you can do at the end of a project, or even at the end of a phase of a larger project, to go through, to learn from, and take, fold those learnings back into the process, to then talk about, here's what we're going to change. Here's what we're going to do differently. Here's what really worked. We want to highlight these aspects of that. So make your methodology that structural change, as well as just reviewing the project itself and sharing the info.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So with that, just to wrap up, again, thank you everybody for watching the show. If you'd like to get in touch with Sharon and I, you can find us here. Of course, we'll be back at the exact same time next Monday and every Monday for the into the foreseeable future. Again, we have right now, we're in not even at the midpoint yet of phase 1 of a 3-year project where we have weekly content. So lots of new content. Is it a lot of work? Yes, but we love this. It's a passion project for us.
Absolutely love it.
If you want to find, this is episode 18. If you want to find the other, 17 episodes, everything is out on YouTube. You can find it under my ID there, Buckley Planet, and out on my blog of buckleyplanet.com as well. We also have this Facebook community, which we are later this year going to move over to its own standalone community. So no information will be owned by Facebook. And there'll be like no reg required. It'll just be an open but community for feedback and documentation and
coming soon.
Hopefully soon. Just more work for us to do, but yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us, everyone, and we will see you next week.
See you next week.